file names much more effectively or at all than they do things that are just parameterized, right? You can have an infinite number of parameters, but really this is meant to represent one resource on the internet. So you really want the world and Google and Bing and the like to see URLs like that. So how do we actually support that? Well, because we now have full access to a web server, notice what I can do. In version 7, I pretty much have the exact same structure. If I go into my HTML directory, it looks like I have the same thing, but let me do an ls-a. Turns out I put an additional dot file, a hidden file that is called .htaccess. This is something that the A in LAMP uses. Apache is probably still the most popular web server software in the world. It's fairly high performing. It's perfectly free. And it's pretty much just omnipresent, though there are even faster solutions for certain types of workflows. But notice what I've done here. I've written these fairly arcane commands that, frankly, even I copy and paste or Google almost every time I try to write stuff like this. Rewrite engine on, so that means turn on something called the rewrite engine. Rewrite base just means what is the base URL in question. Unfortunately, this is necessary sometimes. But if you're making a real website that lives in the root directory, you don't even need that. And then the next two lines are fairly self-explanatory if you know regular expressions. We have here if the URL that the user has visited at this directory starts with lectures and ends with lectures. So remember, the caret symbol is the beginning of the string, $signs end of the string. What do I want to do? So if the user visits something/lectures, I want to actually rewrite that request secretly on the web server as going to index.php page equals lectures. So the user is not going to see this. This is not a redirect in the 301 or 302 sense. This is secretly map this request to index.php on the local server. Similarly, if you see lecture/something, $, go ahead and a little presumptuously map that to index.php page equals lecture ampersand n equals $1. And the $1 means it means the variable. So it's a capturing. Whenever you use parentheses in regular expressions, it usually means you're capturing the value and storing it in numerically indexed numbers, $1, $2, $3, and so forth. So the end result here, even though the code base is identical, if I go into version 7 here and go up to my HTML directory, notice that not only do I get the beautiful base URL, which was a given, but now, wow, look how neat that is, right? And it works for lecture 1 and so forth. So anytime, every blog on the internet does this kind of trick these days, where you have these crazy long addresses, but that nonetheless map to some kinds of HTTP parameters on the inside. So this is a homegrown MVC solution. Let's end by looking at one that's sort of real world. So in the real world, there are a lot of frameworks that are meant to simplify or at least expedite the sort of process that we just went through. Because in fact, if we started using my homegrown MVC solution, we would very quickly start to realize, gee, I wish this function existed. Or gee, I wish this function existed. And by functions, I mean things like form validation or error checking or a lot of the tedious stuff that you have to deal with any kind of web development. It'd be nice if someone handed that to me. So folks like CodeIgniter or Yi or Cake PHP or Symfony, or there's dozens of PHP and Python and Ruby frameworks out there. But among the simplest in the PHP world is this thing called CodeIgniter, which has both pluses and minuses. But what it will allow us to do once downloaded and installed before you start, whoops, wrong lecture, before you start writing code, is it will implement this workflow for us. So CodeIgniter comes with a single index.php file, much like we just wrote ourselves. And then all of these arrows and boxes represent various modules or classes that these folks have written that your code then becomes part of. So routing just refers to the feature of CodeIgniter, much like my htaccess file, to figure out where certain requests go based on the URL. Security means scrubbing your inputs for you. You never have to call HTML special chars again or remember what the function is called. All that just happens for you. Application controller, you write this. This is your controller that actually implements your particular application, the views you write. But caching, this idea of keeping around all the hard work I just did, let the framework do that for you. And then all of these boxes back here just refer to either one, additional library functions that you get for free, like a render function, or things called models, which represent actual things that you might have in a database. So let's take a look. Where did this come from? If I Google CodeIgniter and go to downloads, I literally, to get started with this, downloaded a big zip file from codeigniter.com, and then I unzipped it, and I started deleting things I didn't care about. And I was left with this directory structure. And this will be among the activities in this week's lab and also with the first project. So this is the last MVC example here, but this time I'm standing on the shoulders of this framework called CodeIgniter. So let's look in HTML first. In HTML is this index file. And it's a little scarier than mine, certainly, but frankly, it's like 80% comments. And this is essentially doing what my controller was doing. It's looking at the URL and figuring out to whom to route this request. So I should never need to touch this index file after I configure it for the first time. So I made a tiny little change. I changed quote unquote system to / system. Because even CodeIgniter by default assumes you're going to put everything in the equivalent of public HTML. I don't like that. I want to put the dangerous stuff outside of the HTML folder. So I added a .. there, and I added a .. somewhere else in this file that did the same thing. Yeah, it's elsewhere in the file. All right, so that's one of 3 directories down. Let's see what's in the other 2. So system, I really don't care about. This is CodeIgniter. All of the code that group of volunteers wrote lives in that directory, and it provides you with all of the features that you can then start taking for granted. What do I mean by features? Well, let me go back to CodeIgniter's website for just a moment. Go to user guide. And what you'll see here, frankly, this is, I always forget about this. Bad user interface, but if you want to see the table of contents, you have to remember to click up here, and then this comes down. But this is to say there's a whole lot of functionality. And we're not going to care about most of this, but what the laundry list of functionality means here is that if you do want things to manipulate images or form validation or a whole bunch of common tasks, kind of comes for you out of the box with something like this. But let's see the MVC aspect of it. So system is not interesting, so that leaves only application, which, as the name suggests, is my application. So in the application folder, and again, the spec in the lab will walk us through this, the config directory has some configuration. When we care about a database, it's going to have my database username and password and stuff like that. In controllers is going to be my application controllers, so we'll see that in just a moment. And then in views are going to be the templates and the actual visuals of HTML that I want to render. So let's go into controllers, and there's just one. All I wanted to do was re-implement the idea of this homepage for the course, and here's the convention that I simply have to follow with CodeIgniter. This is a homepage.php file. Notice that I'm defining a class called homepage. I have to capitalize it with a capital H. The file has to be lowercase homepage. These are just stupid but arbitrary conventions that all these frameworks typically make you adhere to, that you can often override them. A little cryptic, but I'm saying extends CI controller. So we talked about the notion of a stock class, which doesn't really have any notion of hierarchy. But if you think, as I think I mentioned last week, about real-world objects like human, and then you have men and women as specific versions of humans, you can imagine some kind of hierarchy in this world of object-oriented programming. And that's what this is alluding to here. There is a class called CI, CodeIgniter Controller, which has a bunch of functionality built in for free. And by saying homepage extends CI controller, I inherit all of that class's functionality and functions and features, but I can add my own. And all I'm going to add is the following. If I add an index method, that is the method that will just automatically get called when I visit the default URL in my site. The method lectures will get called automatically, thanks to configuration of CodeIgniter, anytime I visit /lectures. And lastly, lecture will get called automatically when I visit /lecture/0 or /1. Moreover, it will be passed whatever is after that last slash. So the nice part here is, frankly, the code just looks a lot cleaner. And you might hate certain aspects of any of these frameworks, but it just makes it easier to get up and going quickly. Because lastly, what I have in my views folder is just the layouts in HTML. So I have a homepage directory, which should be where my index, lecture, and lectures files are, and templates. Templates just have header and footer. So in homepage, I have the same kind of stuff as before, super simple index. If I go into lecture, super simple lecture. And so the end result, after all this, 8 versions later, rather than roll any of this myself, if I go into version 8, HTML, voila, I have the same aesthetic result, but I dare say I wrote much less code. And if I now want to start adding other features, a video page, a labs page, and the like, no more copy-paste. I can genericize all of that, write one method like lecture or lab, and then output dynamically only the code I care about. So this is just the beginning of better designed frameworks that we'll look at more in detail next week. First lab will be tomorrow. More information on the course's website. Spec will be up tomorrow. See you next week.